Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be talking about something that I know is on all of our minds, AI chat platforms. Now, we've got a pretty fascinating research paper here. It's called OpenAI Affective-Use-Study.pdf. It's from OpenAI and the MIT Media Lab, and, it's looking at more than just how well these AI tools work, but also how they affect us, the users.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what's really striking here is that as people are using AI for all sorts of practical tasks, right, they're also kind of starting to engage with them on an emotional and social level. And this is exactly what it's trying to understand that deeper connection.
Yeah, I think so many of us have felt that, right? Like, especially those of us who are using these tools regularly. And so for everyone listening today, what we want to do is really break down the findings of this research, focusing on how interacting with AI, whether through text or voice, can actually impact things like your sense of loneliness, how you interact with other people, and maybe even if you start to feel a bit too, reliant on these AI companions. Yeah. So think of this as a deep dive to give you a handle on this super complex and rapidly evolving area.
And yeah, I mean, it is a conversation that we need to be having, right? Because just in the last couple of years, we've seen this huge surge in people using these AI chat platforms. And I think what's really fascinating is how often people, tend to actually personify these systems to give them human-like qualities.
Which leads to this whole concept that researchers call socio-affective alignment. If we can kind of unpack that a bit.
Yeah.
It's not just about the AI's ability to complete tasks or provide information. It's about how it actually interacts with our social and emotional lives, maybe even filling some needs that we don't always consciously recognize.
Exactly. I mean, that's the key insight here, right? We need to look beyond just the functional aspects of AI. We have to consider how this constant back and forth between humans and AI is playing out in our broader social lives and our emotional lives.
Okay, so I'm curious, how did the researchers actually go about studying this? What kind of information did they gather?
Well, they used a really clever, multifaceted approach. The first part focused on how people were actually using ChatGPT in the real world. We're talking about a massive amount of data. They looked at around 36 million automated classifications on over 3 million ChatGPT conversations. And it's important to highlight that they did all of this while, maintaining user privacy.
That's a huge amount of data to sift through.
Right. It is. And on top of that, they followed around 6,000 people who were really heavy users of ChatGPT's voice feature over a period of 3 months just to see how their usage patterns were evolving. And then to round it all out, they conducted surveys with over 4,000 users to get their personal insights and experiences.
So a really comprehensive approach to gather real-world data. Okay, so that was one side of the study. What about the other?
The other side involves something called a randomized controlled trial, or an RCT. This is where they had more control over the experimental conditions. They had 981 participants, and each of them used different configurations of ChatGPT for a period of 28 days.
Okay, so like different types of ChatGPT.
Exactly, yeah. Some people used text-based ChatGPT, others used a neutral-sounding voice version, and others used a version with a more engaging voice, kind of like what we're used to with virtual assistants. And then they were also given different instructions. Some were asked to engage in conversations about personal things, some were given non-personal topics, and others were just given free rein to chat about whatever they wanted.
Interesting. And what did they find?
So this led to over 31,000 conversations that the researchers could then analyze. And one of the really interesting findings was that the people who used the platforms the most, like the top 10% of users, they actually displayed more markers of becoming emotionally dependent on the AI and also reported feeling less socially connected with other people.
Emotional dependence on a chatbot? Wow. That's a bit of a head scratcher, right? It's like you don't really think about that being a possible outcome of interacting with these tools.
Yeah, and I think it really raises some important questions about our relationships with these technologies. I mean, the study confirmed what a lot of us probably suspected, that most people are using these platforms for practical things, right? Getting information, completing tasks, that kind of thing. But there was a noticeable group of these power users who consistently exhibited what they called affective cues in their conversations, signs of emotional engagement.
That makes sense. If you're spending a good amount of time talking to something that feels even somewhat human-like, it's not surprising that some people might develop some level of emotional connection. Now, you mentioned earlier the difference between using voice and using text to interact with the AI. What did the study reveal about that?
Okay, well, this is where it gets really interesting. In the controlled experiment, when they factored in the duration of AI usage, the voice models, both the neutral and the engaging one, were actually linked to better emotional well-being outcomes compared to text. People using voice reported less loneliness, less emotional dependence, and fewer indicators of what they call problematic use.
So that's actually the opposite of what you might expect, right? You'd think that a voice would make the AI feel even more human-like.
Right, right. You would think that, but it's really a lot more nuanced than that, because what they also found was that with the neutral voice model specifically, using it for longer periods of time and having higher levels of initial loneliness, those were actually associated with worse well-being outcomes. So it really seems like the duration of use and your kind of baseline emotional state play a significant role.
It's not just a simple black and white, voice is good, text is bad.
No, not at all. And the real world data actually supported this idea that voice interactions are kind of their own beast, you know. They found that both the regular and the advanced voice modes were significantly more likely, we're talking 3 to 10 times as often, to trigger the AI classifiers that were designed to detect these emotional cues compared to text-based conversations.
So maybe people who are already, predisposed to wanting that kind of connection are self-selecting to use the voice option.
That's definitely a strong possibility. And it's something that researchers are, looking into more. If you're seeking a more emotionally rich experience, you might naturally gravitate towards that voice interface.
You keep mentioning these AI tools that were detecting emotional cues. Can you unpack that a little bit more? Like, what were these exactly, and how did they help the researchers analyze literally millions of conversations?
Yeah, so this is a really cool aspect of the study. They developed something called Emo Classifiers V1, which is essentially a suite of 25 different AI classifiers that were specifically trained to pick up on subtle emotional signals within conversations. And these classifiers used a large language model, another AI, to analyze the text and audio data.
Okay, so AI analyzing AI, very meta.
Right, exactly. And they had this, this kind of two-tiered structure. The top-level classifiers looked at the entire conversation for more general themes like loneliness, vulnerability, potential problematic use, self-esteem, and then possible dependence. And if the conversation triggered one of these top-level classifiers, then a second layer of more specific subclassifiers would kick in.
So like an example of one of these subclassifiers, what would it be trying to find in a conversation?
Sure, yeah. So one example is the pet name subclassifier, which basically looked for instances where the AI assistant used terms of endearment like honey or sweetie. And these more specific classifiers were applied to each individual message or exchange within the conversations that had already been flagged by those first-level classifiers.
Ah. Okay, so the top level is kind of like, is there something here? And then the second level is like, okay, what is it?
Exactly, yeah. And what's interesting is that the voice-based conversations consistently activated these classifiers more often, which kind of aligns with what we were talking about earlier, this idea that voice interaction seems to inherently carry more emotional weight.
That's fascinating. It's almost like the modality itself is influencing the dynamic of the conversation.
Right, exactly.
Now, let's go back to those power users, those who are really heavily engaging with these platforms. How did their interactions differ from, your average user?
So to understand the power users, specifically those who were heavily using the advanced voice mode, the researchers compared them to a control group of randomly selected users. And when they surveyed both groups, they uncovered some really interesting nuances. The control group actually reported relying a bit more on ChatGPT for simply acquiring information and for casual conversations. But both groups acknowledged that it could be a source of support during difficult times.
Interesting. So both groups finding value, but maybe for slightly different reasons.
Exactly. But here's where it gets really interesting. The power users, they actually displayed greater levels of distress when the AI model underwent changes, like an update to its voice or personality. They were also marginally more likely to perceive ChatGPT as a friend and to report feeling more comfortable talking to it than they did engaging in face-to-face interactions.
So that sensitivity to change and that sense of friendship, it really does suggest that there's a stronger emotional connection there, right?
It does. It really does. And so the researchers then decided to focus specifically on these power users for the remainder of their analysis on effective use. What they found was that a small percentage, we're talking the top 10% of these power users, they were consistently triggering those emotional cue detectors. In fact, for some individuals, over 50% of their conversations exhibited these signs. And so this really emphasizes that we're talking about a long-tailed distribution of effective use. It's concentrated within this small but highly engaged segment of users. And surprisingly, they didn't find any significant differences in how often these classifiers were activated between people who used custom instructions, so they were customizing the AI's personality, and those who didn't.
Interesting. So even without actively trying to make the AI more personalized, those connections can still form. Now, did the study look at the relationship between these emotional cues the AI was picking up on and what people were actually saying in the surveys about their feelings and experiences?
Yeah, that was another really interesting part of this. They specifically looked for correlations between classifier activations and user responses in the surveys. Now, this involved a smaller subset of around 400 users, and they had to filter it down to mostly English language conversations. But what they found was really compelling. Users who explicitly stated that they considered ChatGPT to be a friend were significantly more likely to have conversations that triggered those top-level and those more specific emotional cue detectors. And this included things like expressions of affection, attributing human qualities to the AI, and seeking support or validation from it.
It's almost like the AI was validating what the users were reporting. Okay,
Yeah.
now the study also examined how user behavior changed over time, didn't it? So for these power users, what did they find?
Right, so they basically tracked the activation rates of those emotional cue detectors for those power users over the entire 3 months of the study. And they then fit linear models to the data to see if there were any discernible trends. And they essentially identified 3 main patterns of usage. So some people showed decreasing activation rates over time. Others, they exhibited no change or very minimal change. And then a smaller group actually showed increasing activation rates over time. But what's interesting is that most of the trends were either downward or neutral, meaning they weren't showing increasing levels of emotional engagement.
That's actually kind of reassuring, right? Like it's not this sort of, upward spiral of emotional dependence.
It is reassuring to an extent, but I think the researchers also rightly pointed out that with this kind of observational data, it's really hard to establish definitive causality.
Right. Correlation doesn't equal causation.
Exactly, yeah. Changes in user behavior could be influenced by a myriad of external factors, things happening in their personal lives, their mood, all sorts of things. It's hard to isolate the impact of the AI itself.
Which is probably why they did the randomized controlled trial.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The RCT was designed to address some of the limitations of that real-world data. So, things like limited user information, the reliance on self-reported feedback, and the lack of control over the AI configurations and the tasks that people were using it for.
Right. And the RCT involved those 9 different conditions, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where they varied the mode of interaction, the engaging voice, the neutral voice, and the text. And then they also varied the task prompts.
Yeah, exactly. So there's 3 modes of interaction and then the 3 different types of tasks, those personal prompts, non-personal prompts, and then just open-ended conversations. And they gathered data through surveys at various points throughout the study, pre-study demographics, measures of loneliness, socialization, emotional dependence, and then any potential signs of problematic use.
Okay, so with all those variables and all those measurements, what were some of the key findings that emerged from the RCT?
Well, one of the interesting overall findings was that across all the conditions, participants actually reported feeling less lonely by the end of the study, but they also reported spending less time socializing.
So less lonely, but more isolated.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting tension there, and they also found that the more time people spent using the AI in general, the more they reported feeling lonely, socializing less, and exhibiting signs of more problematic use.
So just spending more time with AI, regardless of how you're interacting with it or what you're talking about, might have some kind of social cost.
Yeah, it's a possibility that we have to consider. But here's what's interesting. When they controlled for the duration of use, so factoring in how long people were actually engaging with the AI, the voice modalities, the engaging voice, and the neutral voice, those were actually associated with better emotional well-being outcomes compared to text. They found that people using voice reported feeling less lonely, less emotionally dependent, and had fewer markers of problematic use.
So the voice, again, seemed to have some positive impact. But
Yeah.
you mentioned earlier that there was a caveat with the neutral voice.
Yeah. Using the neutral voice for longer periods was linked to worse socialization outcomes and more signs of problematic use compared to text. So again, it's this really interesting finding, right? That even subtle variations in how the AI presents itself can have divergent effects on users over time.
Right. So it's really a complex interplay of factors. Now,
Yeah.
what about the types of conversations people were having? Those personal versus non-personal prompts.
Right. So when they controlled for duration, the personal conversations were actually linked to increased feelings of loneliness, but decreased levels of emotional dependence, and fewer markers of problematic use compared to the open-ended conversations. However, this effect actually became non-significant as people used the AI more.
Okay, so maybe with longer use, those differences become less pronounced.
Exactly, yeah. They also found that initial emotional well-being was a significant predictor of post-interaction emotional states. So how you're feeling going into the interaction really seems to influence how you feel coming out of it. And what's really interesting is that for those individuals who scored higher on measures of initial emotional dependence and problematic use, the engaging voice model actually appeared to help mitigate those issues compared to text.
Okay, so for those who are maybe already struggling with those feelings, the more personable AI might actually have been beneficial in the short term.
That's what the research suggests. And then when they looked at usage patterns in the RCT, they saw that same long-tail pattern that they observed in the real-world data, with a small group of participants clocking in significantly higher usage times than the rest. And within this high usage group, those in the top deciles, there is a strong correlation with lower levels of socialization, greater emotional dependence, and then more signs of problematic use.
Okay. And I think you mentioned earlier that the combination of engaging voice and the open-ended conversation format, that was particularly common among these very high users.
Yeah, exactly. It seems like that particular pairing, a more personable AI coupled with the freedom to talk about anything, might create an environment where people just feel more comfortable spending more time, maybe even forming stronger emotional bonds.
Makes sense.
Okay.
What about the topics that people were actually talking about in the RCT? Did they find any interesting patterns there?
So to analyze conversation topics, they used GPT-4o, another AI, to generate summaries of the conversations. And then they further categorized these summaries into 15 different topic categories using another AI, GPT-4o Mini.
Okay. AI all the way down.
Right. And as you might expect, people who were given those personal prompts, their conversations tended to revolve around themes of emotional support, casual talk, advice. The non-personal prompts, those tended to lead to more discussions about explanations, brainstorming, and advice seeking. But in the open-ended conversations, those who were using the engaging voice model, they actually engaged in significantly more casual talk and fewer fact-based queries compared to the other groups. And as the total usage time in these open-ended conversations increased, so did the proportion of casual conversation.
So again, that engaging voice seemed to be fostering a more informal social dynamic. Okay. So if we take a step back and look at the big picture here, you're combining the insights from both the real-world data analysis and the controlled experiment. What are some of the key takeaways that we should really remember from this study?
So I think it's pretty clear that people who heavily use these AI chat platforms, those top users, they do tend to display more of those affective cues, those emotional signals in their conversations. And as we've seen, this isn't uniformly distributed. It's concentrated within this smaller subset of highly engaged users.
And it seems like audio interaction in particular, using voice to talk to the AI, has these really complex implications.
Right. The real-world data suggested that people who are perhaps seeking emotional connection are more likely to opt for the voice interface. And while the controlled study hinted at some potential short-term well-being benefits, especially for certain types of users, we really have to be mindful of the duration of use and, our own kind of baseline emotional state going in.
And I think this study really highlights the value of taking a multifaceted approach, looking at both how people are using these tools in the real world and then conducting controlled experiments to really tease apart those cause and effect relationships.
Absolutely. I mean, it really underscores the complexity of the issue. And I think the development of those AI tools to automatically detect those emotional cues, that's a really promising development for future research. It allows us to study massive amounts of data while preserving user privacy.
It is, and it speaks to this kind of burgeoning field of AI ethics and responsible AI development.
Exactly. And, while these classifiers aren't perfect, they do offer a valuable way to identify these patterns of emotional engagement at scale. And the researchers rightly emphasize that these human model interactions are deeply subjective. We need insights from fields like psychology, sociology, and philosophy to truly grasp the full scope of what's happening here.
And that brings us back to that idea of socio-affective alignment, right?
Yeah.
It's not just about building functional AI. It's about understanding how these systems integrate into our very human, emotional, and social landscapes.
Right. And that's something we need to keep in mind, both as developers and as users, as we navigate this increasingly AI-driven world.
So for you, the listener, if you are using these tools, what are the key things to remember from this deep dive into this research?
Well, I think the main takeaway is that excessive use of these AI chatbots, especially in voice mode, And when engaging in conversations about personal matters, it can be linked to an increase in feelings of emotional dependence and potentially a decrease in real-world social connection.
And of course, everyone is different. Your experience with these tools is going to be uniquely your own, but it's still important to be aware of these potential trends.
Absolutely. The study showed that while a majority of people are using these tools for practical purposes, for those more functional tasks, those signs of emotional connection tend to be more prevalent among a smaller group, those highly engaged users. And, as we've discussed, how AI ultimately affects your well-being is complex. It's influenced by individual factors, it's influenced by usage patterns, and it's something that really deserves further research and attention as we continue to interact with these tools more and more.
That's a really clear and helpful summary. And I think it leaves us with a really important question. Given all of this, how can we, both as developers and as users, ensure that we're engaging with these tools in a way that is healthy, that is balanced, that is beneficial, and that ultimately supports our overall well-being? It's definitely something to keep in mind. So thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and we will see you next time.